exactly understand what you meant about the Islamic terrorism.
Well, given the war in Iraq, that we were over there perhaps in the face of radical Islamic terrorism.
No, there's no, look, that was a fabrication. There is no evidence whatsoever. I mean, Iraq was Saddam Hussein's a horrible monster, just as he was when he was supported by the United States, the people now in office in the 1980s. He was a hideous monster. Osama bin Laden is another hideous monster, but they're different monsters, and they hate each other. And there's no evidence whatsoever of any meaningful evidence of a connection between Saddam Hussein's horrifying regime and the networks like Al-Qaeda. They despise each other and have had no known connections. The only effect of the war in Iraq on terror is that it has, as predicted, increased recruitment for Al-Qaeda. So it's increased the threat of terror. Exactly as predicted by intelligence agencies in the United States and throughout the world and other specialists. But the idea that attacking Iraq had something to do with the war on terror is just mendacity.
Quick follow-up, Carlsbad.
Yes, sir. Thank you. With respect to foreign policy and the potential for peace in the Middle East, do you think that first world countries, which have a tremendous ability to provide resources and aid to developing countries, can promote peace in the face of Arab humiliation and overcome Israeli defensiveness?
Well, we have to ask. There's here I think we might listen to the leading specialists on the topic, namely from Israeli intelligence. So the former chief of Israeli military intelligence just pointed out in a book in Hebrew that until Israel is willing to treat Arabs with respect as decent, as human beings with rights, there will never be an end to terror. 20 years earlier, a former head of Israeli military intelligence, Yoshavat Harkabi, said essentially the same thing. He said, until we deal with the legitimate grievances and demands of the Palestinian people under military occupation, there will always be the threat of terror. He was writing at a time when Israel was virtually immune from terror from within the territories. Just in the year 2000, the head of the Israeli secret police, Shabak, the general security services which control the occupied territories, essentially said the same thing. He said, until we deal with the legitimate grievances and demands of the Palestinian population under occupation, we will never put an end to terror. So the humiliation is there, and the degradation is there, and the repression is there, yes, it does lead to sometimes to terror, certainly opposition. And incidentally, if we want to look ourselves in the mirror, as we should, this goes way back. George Bush is not the first president to ask, why do they hate us? Almost 50 years ago, President Eisenhower, in internal discussions with his staff, which have since been declassified, discussed what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by governments, which are on our side, but by the people. And his National Security Council gave an explanation for it. They said that there is a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports corrupt and oppressive regimes which block democracy and development, and that we do it because of our interest in controlling the oil reserves of the region. And furthermore, they said that perception is correct, so it's very difficult to counter. And they said, yes, we have to continue doing it. You hear the same feelings expressed today, even by wealthy Muslim managers of multinational corporations. They perceive the United States correctly as supporting brutal, corrupt, repressive regimes that are blocking democracy and development. And yes, that leads to antagonism and often hatred. It's not the source of Osama bin Laden, but it is the reservoir of background that the heads of Israeli military intelligence and the secret police were talking about. We have to be serious about that if you want to stop terrorism. I mean, the same's true elsewhere. Take, say, Northern Ireland. As long as the British responded to IRA terror with just escalation of violence, it increased the terror. When they came to the point of beginning to deal with the legitimate grievances, it did improve the situation enormously. It's not a utopia, but it's much better than it was 10 years ago.
Stamford, Connecticut, for Noam Chomsky. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Chomsky, I share your views and revulsion at much of U.S. foreign policy, and I think you're right. Once you understand it, it's irrefutably cruel, evil, and ruthlessly self-interested in many, many, many instances. And I find you to be an invaluable voice of criticism and dissent, yet your views almost never appear in the mainstream media. Do you feel you're censored at some level by the mainstream organs in this country?
Well, I wouldn't call it censorship. You're right that I don't appear in the mainstream media, and not just me, but the same is true of other critical voices. The media do, in fact, reflect a pretty rigid and, I think, narrow spectrum of opinion. And if you don't belong to it, you don't appear there. It's not censorship, it's their choice and decision.
Sharon, Pennsylvania, you're on with Noam Chomsky. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I have some disagreement, but most agreement with you. And one of the it's in the point that I feel you don't go far enough. For instance, just on the last point, for instance, NPR. I've read that even when you're speaking to a smaller audience at American University, from which NPR broadcasts this Diane Rehm show, you've been barred from that program, even when you're very conveniently to be interviewed. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the chairman of NPR is the former head of all CIA propaganda foreign broadcast, and the head, for instance, of PBS is the former head of Voice of America. Now, when you've got that on the supposed alternative to the corporate media, the big business media, which is interlocked and owned by military-industrial weapons manufacturers and colludes with the CIA, I think there is quite a bit of censorship. And I do read your stuff on ZMAG.org, like a previous caller, and it's very useful, and I think that it doesn't go far enough in many cases. For instance, you claim that somehow it's not plausible that the administration or a faction within intelligence supporting the administration had prior knowledge and saw that the only one that would benefit from this attack in 9/11 would be the warmongers within the Bush administration and the police state factions within the Ashcroft Justice Department. I think is belied by the fact, and this gets to the media, that James Bamford, the top NSA expert who wrote the book Body of Evidence, points out from declassified State Department and Pentagon documents that in the early 60s, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Undersecretary of Defense had plans to terror bomb American cities, murder American citizens, even bomb an American ship in Guantanamo Harbor to frame up Cuba, to blame Cuba for these U.S. Government-planned bombings, and then use it as a pretext to invade. Now, there is a real precedent there. It was only called off by the Kennedy administration because apparently they figured that it might go awry. But it shows that there are these clones of this very fanatical ultra-right faction, almost duplicate at that time within the high levels of government that correspond to this Bush administration with its plans for world domination.
Thanks, caller. Mr. Chomsky.
Well, what you're referring to is Operation Northwood. It's declassified. You can read it if you like. It was a contingency plan called at the request of the Department of Defense. And it did have roughly the character you describe. But if you look at contingency plans, they are all over the map. They've got plans for everything. And it was not implemented. And it wasn't the only one. There were other plans that came from the more liberal sectors of the Kennedy administration. For example, plans to stage what would look like a Cuban invasion of Haiti, which could then be used as a basis for invading Cuba. Actually, that one came from Arthur Schlesinger, way over at the liberal end. But from looking at contingency plans by governments, I don't think you can conclude very much. On the 9/11 event, you have to make a crucial distinction between two things. The earlier question, at least as I understood it, was whether the Bush administration was involved in planning it. For that, I think it's outlandish. The question you're asking is whether there could have been foreknowledge of it. Well, that's conceivable. But then we have to be a little cautious, because remember that in 1993, almost 10 years earlier, there was an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center, which came very close to succeeding. And if it had succeeded, would have caused tens of thousands of deaths. Since that time, there was no doubt in the intelligence community that operations of this kind were possible and might take place. Whether there was any foreknowledge of this one, I haven't seen any convincing evidence of that, but it's conceivable.
In a moment, we're going to take a break, and our guest, Noam Chomsky, is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a BA, an MA, and a PhD. Got out of there in 1955, has been at MIT since 1960?
55.
Actually 55, and has published a total of 98 books over these years. You have 3 children, Diane, Avi, and Harry.
That's right.
Where are each of them today? What are they doing?
Avi's the oldest is teaching at Salem State College near Boston, Latin American, specialist in Latin American history, teaches history. Diane, our second daughter, is happens to be in Mexico at the moment, but is primarily living in Nicaragua, where she's been about 15 years, has her family there. Our son Harry, the third child, is living in the Bay Area, works in software engineering, that kind of thing.
We have about an hour and 45 minutes to go, and we'll be back with Noam Chomsky and more, and your calls in just a moment.
About 10 years ago, the United States had the highest wages in the world, which is what you'd expect. This is the richest country in the world by far, and it has absolutely unparalleled advantages. real wages